Welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. Today is August the 27th, 2018, and this is podcast number 14. Today we're going to be talking about a very peculiar topic. We are going to talk about racism. Now, before we go further, let me say that racism is a controversial issue. People have different approaches, different understandings, different ways of looking at the concept, and I am not going to debate the concept in depth here. So I did not really want to talk about this, but there are so many things that are happening in my life at this point, so many things that are affecting my life that I feel like I have an obligation to speak up a little bit. And in this podcast, I am going to do just that. Now, you may not agree with what I'm about to say, but don't take it personally, because I am not criticizing you personally. I am not criticizing your country. I am not criticizing your community, but I am talking about those who have one way or another targeted me or targeted my family, and at this point I feel like I have to say something in public. So that's what this podcast is about. As usual, without further ado, let us get to it. Today, we're going to talk about a very controversial topic. The reason this topic is controversial, it is not necessarily because it is an inherent controversial issue or an inherent contested issue. It is controversial because there's a certain bad faith on the part of the people who approach the subject. There is, for the most part, a reluctance to admit the obvious. There is, for the most part, a desire to suppress the reality that is before everybody else's eyes. And that's one of the reasons the concept of racism is often contested. It is not because the person who contests it does not know the existence of racism. It is because sometimes it does not suit them to admit that. Okay. But there's also another side of the subject, and that is when people want to use the concept or want to use racism as a way to admonish others, as a way to lambaste others, as a weapon, so to speak. So some people are automatically on the defensive when people call them racist. But there are also those who are automatically on the offense when people do something to them they do not understand, they do not comprehend, and they automatically label that as being racist. The answer lies in the middle. Because sometimes what people do to one another is racist in a way that it is based on the fact that the other is the other. Whenever you treat a person, whether that person is black, white, Latino, or whatnot, whenever you treat a person not because of what they do, what they represent, what they've accomplished or not accomplished. Whenever you treat somebody in this regard, you automatically put yourself in a position where your behavior could be understood as racist. The concept of racism is not that difficult to understand, because when we're talking about racism, the fundamental thing we have to understand, the fundamental understanding we have to have, is that it is a behavior that is based on race. Now, this brings us to the logical question, that is, what is race? Now, there are many schools of thought on this. Some believe that race is a denomination within the human species, and that denomination is based on skin tone, skin color, physical shape, types, or what we call the phenotype of the individual. Okay. So based on that logic, somebody who happens to look different from another is of a different race of the other. Of course, it is a fallacious way of looking at it. It is a fallacy in and of itself, but this is one way of looking at the term race. Okay? The other way, which is the way I am more inclined to look at the term, is by looking at race within the confound of the human race itself, within the confound of humanity. By that logic, if you are a human being, if you are a humanoid, whether or not you have a particular physical characteristic, if you are a human being, you fall under the category of the human race. And any distinction within that category has to be in relation to anything but a human being. In other words, the human race only applies in relation to other living entities, or the dogs, the horses, the lions and whatnot. Okay? Because if we are talking about humanity as a unit, we could not have subunits within the unit of humanity itself. And I think somehow, somewhere, the former definition, which is the definition that includes particularities of the human species in terms of physical nuances, physical differences as subcategories of humanoid, that understanding has led to our misunderstanding of what racism is. Okay. By definition, racism is a behavior. It's a way of treating the other. Okay. When you treat a person a way, or when you do not treat a person a particular way, because that person happens to be a person, by the latter definition, that's racism. If you deprive a human being something for the simple fact that he or she is a human being, that's racism. If you treat a person differently because he or she is a person, that's racism. But we tend to look at the term in terms of what one particular group does to another. I disagree with that understanding, because I do not think racism has anything to do with being black or being white or being Latino and whatnot. Because at the end of the day, we are all racist, or we all have a tendency to behave in such a way. Now, the reason I am bringing this up today, it is because, I have found it very difficult to live in an environment where I am treated or persons like me are treated differently simply because we look different. Simply because we happen to come from a different country in the world. And by definition, or at least by the definition I mentioned before, this is racism. So it doesn't matter whether a white person is treating me in a way, or a black person is treating me in a way, or a Latino is treating me in a way, so long as I am being treated differently because I happen to look different and be different, that is racism. Now, as I said before, I understand there's a certain tendency to recoil when the subject is, when we're talking about this subject. Because sometimes people have a view of racism that does not necessarily fit the narrative of the mainstream understanding of what racism is or ought to be. I am not mainstream. I do not see the world from a mainstream lens. I see the world from the little corner where I stand. What I see is based on what I can see and understand. I should never see the world according to you, according to them, according to they. I could never do that. If I were to see the world from that prism, I would do a disservice to myself. I would do a disservice to my capacity to be. I have to experience the world to know the world. Otherwise, everything else I hear about the world, those are things that I hear about the world. So I could not speak about those experiences, for I have not lived them personally. So my understanding of the world has to be inherently subjective. Now, if it happens that my experience is similar to yours, then it is okay for us to have a similar understanding about the world. But that does not necessarily make it what the world is. It is our understanding about the world. It is our view of what we've experienced in the world, okay? That does not make it less important. That does not make it more important than what others have gone through, okay? And I think that's where the debate about racism sort of takes a turn for the worse. Because there are those who have a particular view about the world. Some have a particular view about their world. But they want to impose that view onto others. They want you to agree with them as if this is how the world is and this is how we ought to accept it to be, when it is not like that for me. See, when we are talking about racism, I have a very different experience. It might not be racism to you because from where you stand, that's not how it looks. And that's okay. But from where I am standing, or from where I stand, that's how it feels. And it should be okay. You should be okay if this is how I feel. It may not have been your intention to make me feel this way. It could be that you did not want to make me feel this way. But at the end of the day, this is how I feel. And you have an obligation to acknowledge how I feel. You have an obligation to change the course of your behavior in relation to how I feel. And this is what civilization is about. This is what conviviality is about. This is what humility is about. You have to understand where the other is coming from. Why the other feels this way about you or about the people around you. If you're going to accept that the other is not insane, if the other tells you what it is you're doing to him is offensive in X or Y way, you have to acknowledge that and adjust the way you're treating the other. And when you refuse to acknowledge the other, when you refuse to change the course of your behavior towards the other, you are perpetrating racism. And it doesn't matter that you are black, white, Latino or not. What matters is the way you treat the other. If you treat the other in a demeaning way, degrading way, denying the other the opportunity to be, removing the other from the opportunities, okay, preventing the other from enjoying their lives or his or her life. If you are going to treat the other this way, the other has no other alternative but to think about you as being a racist. If you are not a racist, if you don't want to be perceived as a racist, you have to acknowledge the other and adjust your behavior towards the other. It doesn't make sense that you find it easy to deny the other's suffering. It does not make any sense to justify your behavior towards the other by ignoring the other, by ignoring what you have done to the other. I think it is important when we are talking about racism, we understand why it is still a major issue in society. It is simply because we do not want to acknowledge that we are racist to some extent. We do not want to acknowledge that sometimes we don't do it because we wanted to do it. We do it inadvertently. We do it just because we weren't paying attention to what we were doing to the other. But the other, from where he is standing, he feels that behavior as you being against his beingness. When you attack me as a person, when you see my livelihood as unworthy, when you treat me in a way that you are telling to the world that I don't deserve to be, that is racism. Whether or not you did it intentionally, it's irrelevant. And the minute you know that your behavior to me, towards me or my family, is of that nature, you have an obligation to correct it. And failure of you to do so is blatant racism. You could tell me all the reasons in the world for your behavior. You could explain to the world why you do or didn't do. But at the end of the day, if your behavior is affecting the other in a way that is demeaning, degrading, humiliating, that is racism. Now, we could debate as to when, how, or the degree of the racism, but we could not debate the existence of it because it is the way a human being treats another. So long as you treat the other because he is the other, that is racism. Now, I understand that this is a peculiar conversation we are having today. And quite frankly, this is not a conversation that I wanted to have, especially knowing the nature of social media these days. When people don't agree with what you have to say, they immediately censor you. What you have to say has absolutely no value because they don't happen to agree with it. So I would not have taken this conversation here. But I have no choice. As a man of color, living in America for about 20 years now, I feel like I am living in hell. As a man of color, living in America for almost 2 decades, I feel like I am living in hell. The way people treat me, the way they treat my family, is nothing short of racism. Of course, they could deny it, and they do have a right to deny it. They do have a right to deny, but I also have a right to acknowledge it. When what they do to me or what they do to my family, from their vantage point, is not racism, it is applying the law, applying their policy, applying whatever it is that they think they can use to justify their behavior. If this is how they can justify that behavior, it's irrelevant to me. It is irrelevant to me because from where I stand, this is a discrimination against me. From where I stand, this is a discrimination against my family. From where I stand, this is a discrimination against my livelihood. And since I am being treated like the other, simply because I am the other, then I can only call it racism. You could agree, you could disagree. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. If it quacks like a dog, walks like a dog, swims like a dog, then it is a dog. If it feels like racism, smells like racism, and hurts like racism, then there's no doubt it is racism. You could agree to disagree. You could deny it, but that would not change the fact that it is what it is.